Darwin amassed a whole lot of information in favour of evolution. And while we do talk about the theory of evolution, I think we can quite confidently say that evolution is a fact, that Darwin's material proved evolution, and material that has come since then is further proof of it. Information from such fields, branches of science as embryology, the development of organisms, is very, very remarkable that an embryo fish, an embryo mammal, an embryo reptile in their early stages are almost indistinguishable. Human embryos never actually look like fishes, but they look remarkably like, in their very early stages, the embryos of fishes. And in the development of mammals, for example, there are in the neck a whole set of blood vessels, 5 arches of blood vessels, which exactly resemble the arches that develop into the gill arches, providing the blood supply to the gill of fishes. As mammals develop further, most of those arches actually disappear, and only 1 or 2 are left. The big arterial arch that comes down to the main aorta and so on. So there was a whole lot of information, and quite a lot of this Darwin was able to tap into. And he established the fact of evolution. And actually Engels talks about Darwin establishing the fact of evolution. It's not just anymore, I believe, a theory. But when we talk about Darwin's theory of evolution, we're talking about a little bit more than just the fact that evolution occurred. Because, as I've said, what Darwin did when he looked at plant and animal breeders was to begin to postulate a way in which evolution could have happened. And he said, the plant breeder, the animal breeder, can select what he wants. There's variation in organisms. What happens in the natural world, outside the world of the plant breeder, is that these variations are selected by the environment. But there are some variations which make the animal more suitable to its surroundings than others. And those with the variations which are more suitable to their surroundings breed more readily, and they become and those features become more dominant in the population. Of course, if animals are living in very constant circumstances for years and years and years, there won't be very much change. But when change does happen, then the variations can be selected for that are most suitable to that change. And that really is the basis of Darwin's suggestion of the origin of species by the process of natural selection. Okay? But together with this comes the idea of the survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence. And there we get into more difficult waters, because some of this has been quite seriously distorted, and some of this has been used really against Darwin and against the idea of evolution. Darwin actually suggested that there were particles in the blood of animals that carried information from various cells of the body to the sex cells, the egg cells and the sperm cells, so that this information about what had happened to animals could be passed on to their offspring. He didn't go into this in great detail. He made no particular study of it. And in fact, some of the criticism of Darwin, and a guy called Düring, who you've heard of from the anti-Düring fame, actually criticised Darwin because he didn't say where the variations had come from. And Engels, in response to that, in his book Anti-Düring, actually points out that Darwin was actually focusing on evolution as a fact and trying to understand a way in which that evolution could come about. He didn't try and show how variations could come about, but nonetheless he opened the door for that investigation to happen, and he was quite legitimate in doing that because the very fact of variations were there for all to see. He didn't have to prove that variations occurred. That was known, so he didn't have to prove how they came about. Now, I'm not going to go into a great detail, I think, about opposition to creationism. We've mentioned it already about the Reverend and his time scale, and I think for most of us there isn't any particular difficulty in realising that the idea of special creation, the idea that every organism was specially created, has been thoroughly disproved. But nonetheless, the idea of the evolution in the natural world certainly presents a lot of problems for those who want to maintain a system that they claim is here forever and is here to stay. And what happened was that following Darwin, a lot of scientists either jumped on the bandwagon or distorted materials. And a man called Weizmann, who I've spoken about in the Stalin Society before, actually developed Darwinism, and he developed it to say that there is an explanation for variation in organisms of a particular species, the differences of organisms in a particular species. And the explanation for that is simply this, that there is a blueprint for the body and the functioning of an organism which is contained in the egg, that blueprint determines what the organism is going to look like and how it's going to behave, but it is not affected at all by what happens to the organism in its life. That blueprint is passed on as it is to the next generation, making the body form of the next generation and passed on to the next generation without being affected by or changed in any way by what happens to each generation in the lives that they lead. So how does change come about? What Weizmann says was that this change comes about completely arbitrarily. It comes about entirely by accident, by mistakes, if you like, in the blueprint, by what you would probably understand better if we use the term of genetics, by mutations of the genes of an organism. Most of these mistakes create something which just can't be built at all. But very occasionally, one of these random mistakes produces a beneficial variation which will survive, and in fact, which can be selected by natural selection for future development, and that feature will gradually become more and more common, and the organisms develop in that way. Now, I don't know if I've got that over clearly enough. This was the theory put forward by Weizmann, the theory of neo-Darwinism.